For 12 days in June 1992, world leaders met in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. The conference, more commonly known as the Rio Earth Summit, brought together representatives of 172 countries, including 116 heads of state, to determine the future agenda of global environmental governments. With 9,000 journalists following and reporting on the negotiations, the summit was a huge media spectacle. A large contingent of non-governmental organizations also assembled in Rio, providing a counterpoint to the official conference. Altogether, more than 35,000 people participated in the largest gathering of world leaders that had ever been seen. The Rio Summit was meant to build on what was achieved at the landmark 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, Sweden. The Stockholm Conference produced inspirational declarations linking environmental protection and human development, and led to the creation of the United Nations Environment Program. But it only marked the start of more detailed international conversations that needed to be had about sustainability. Discussions at Rio were intended to hammer out what exactly sustainable development would entail. The declaration outlining 27 principles for sustainable development, an agenda describing actions needed to promote sustainability, and conventions on forestry, climate change, and biological diversity all in the works and on the negotiating table, Rio was supposed to start global action to repair the environment. Momentous work was supposed to be done. The opening remarks of key UN players like Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the Secretary-General of the UN, Maurice Strong, the Canadian organizer of the summit, and Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway and head of the World Commission on Environment and Development, carried dramatic apocalyptic overtones, describing environmental problems as threats to civilization. Strong, for instance, stated in his address that awesome challenges confronted the conference, saying that it would define the state of political will to save our planet and make it a secure and hospitable home for present and future generations. By portraying environmental issues as a security threat, Strong, Boutros-Ghali, Brundtland, and others attempted to galvanize the diverse interest groups represented at the conference into unified global action. It's important to remember that the Rio Earth Summit was taking place only 6 months after the official dissolution of the Soviet Union. After a tense 40-some-odd years worrying about whether the US and the Soviet Union were going to blow up the world leaders and the public could easily identify with issues articulated as security threats. That's not to say that exploding world population, deepening disparities between the rich and the poor, pollution, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity didn't actually represent real threats to the well-being of humanity. But the way in which major actors at Rio framed sustainable development issues, in terms of global security, and drew on excitement about the end of the Cold War, could account for the unprecedented attention given to environmental issues by world leaders and international media. This attention is ultimately what pushed the idea of sustainable development into the mainstream. Following the breakdown of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Rio Conference had the opportunity to address a seemingly much more unified world. Unlike in 1972, when most communist nations snubbed the Stockholm Conference, this time Eastern Europe was well represented at the summit. Boutros Boutros-Ghali proclaimed that in a world in the process of unification, security had become less of a military matter and more of a problem connected to sustainable development. The Secretary-General conveyed a deep sense of urgency in his speech, proclaiming to delegates, "Never will so much depend on what you do or do not do here." Maurice Strong, whose opening statement was peppered with references to serious threats to the world's survival, stressed the importance of the unity of nations for the future of the planet. He declared, "We are either going to save the whole world or no one will be saved. We must here on in all go down the same path." Brundtland continued, explaining the need for radical decisions working toward resolving the common challenge of securing humanity's survival. Voices from outside the UN reiterated these messages. Michel Perrault, Vice President of the Sierra Club's International Program, wrote in a June 10th article in the San Diego Union Tribune that while the last 50 years had been dominated by a military threat, the next 50 would be defined by an environmental one. Calling the environment the new battleground, she argued that the Earth Summit was the perfect place for George Bush, as leader of the last superpower, to ensure the security of the future. The media ate up these urgent messages, spreading them in headlines such as "Is it apocalypse now?" in Newsweek and "Summit to Save the Earth" in Time magazine. David Suzuki commented the following year that the media sensation surrounding the Rio conference raised hopes that it would usher in a major shift to a more sustainable civilization. What's more, politicians at least claimed to be taken by these ideas. That the vast majority of world leaders attended the conference hints at just how critically important environmental issues were beginning to be considered as the world emerged from the Cold War. As Marco Azambua, a Brazilian diplomat, opined, no head of state could afford not to attend the conference. Nevertheless, one conclusion drawn from the suggestion that environmental hazards had replaced military threats as the chief concern for the world would go too far for some leaders. That is the suggestion that military spending from then on should be directed to development projects in the global south. Boutros Ghali and Brundtland, along with many developing world leaders, including Fidel Castro and the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, a small island country whose existence was threatened by the prospect of rising sea levels, all made the same idealistic comment. Boutros Ghali argued that military spending should be diverted to planetary development projects in the Third World in the form of debt-for-nature swaps. Brundtland proclaimed that a sharp reduction in the arms race and the expected peace dividend can be used to finance today's most urgent form of collective security, environmental security. The Prime Minister of Tuvalu exclaimed that doing so was pure common sense. All of these players expressed sustainability goals using the familiar security-focused logic of the Cold War. But however sensible these arguments may have seemed, developed countries were not prepared to simply fork over the resources they no longer needed to spend on militarization to countries in the global south. Although the fall of communism meant that the world was more unified in one way, the Earth Summit exposed another way in which the nations of the world were still deeply divided by the different and sometimes contradictory interests of developed and developing nations. Third world demands at the summit for aid went largely unmet, partly because a recession had hit wealthier countries. Bickering between the global north and south characterized much of the conference and ultimately undermined many goals of creating specific and legally binding sustainable development initiatives. Friction over national sovereignty rights sunk the negotiations of a convention on forestry, and a particularly dramatic moment occurred when George Bush refused to sign the Convention on Biological Diversity. The president claimed that provisions in the treaty for the sharing of information and income generated by research on genetic resources sourced in the developing world would hurt the American biotechnology industry. In the end, despite lofty rhetoric about global solidarity and strong efforts to convey the threat posed by environmental problems, it was nationalism, not internationalism, and short-term thinking, not long-term thinking, that prevailed over the Earth Summit. As The Economist magazine put it, it was ultimately greenbacks, not greenery, that mattered at Rio. That said, the Earth Summit was not a total flop. As such a huge event, it pushed thinking about sustainable development into the mainstream, not least because major figures in the UN were able to show that in the post-Cold War era, the world's biggest threat to security was its own mistreatment of nature.